Hello. I'd like to talk today about the Reformed religion's influence on the American Revolution. Many historians and scholars link events such as the Enlightenment or men such as Montesquieu and Locke with the foundings of the American Revolution. And while those may be valid connections, I believe we tend to undermine the role that the Reformed religion played in the American Revolution. Through a study of the Reformed religion's active participation in the Revolution, their ecclesiastical structure and doctrinal beliefs, one can see how the Reformed religion played an active and pivotal role in the American Revolution. And let us understand, when I'm talking about Reformed religion, those are religions that have come out of the Reformation, such as Presbyterianism, Baptists, Congregationalists. First, it is important to establish the extent of the influence that the Reformed religion had on the colonies. Often people believe that their influence was limited to the New England colonies, or just to the religious sphere. But a study of sources shows that's not necessarily true. In Leonard Kramer's Presbyterian's Approach to the American Revolution, he discusses how all regions of America were influenced. He goes as far as to say that in the middle colonies, Presbyterianism had its greatest strength. In an article by Mark Hall, he talks about how the Reformed religion made up the religious heritage of 3/4 of American people in 1776. 82% of New Englanders were Congregationalists. 51% of people in the middle colonies practiced the Reformed religion, and 58% of people in the southern colonies practiced the Reformed religion. He also says that in the late 18th century, in the South, Presbyterianism was the fastest growing faith in the region. Obviously, that goes to show that the Reformed religion's influence was in all of the colonies. In addition, the colonists from an early age were introduced to religious ideas. Take the New England Primer, for example. It was a Calvinist reading textbook that children would read to learn how to read. It included biblical doctrines. They learned the alphabet through learning Bible verses. So obviously, religion played an important part early on in the colonists' lives. But the Reformed religion influenced more than just the religious sphere. In John Adams' A Dissertation of Canon and Feudal Law, he talks about how he believes knowledge first came to America through religious organizations. You see, America was short of clergymen, and so oftentimes the laymen had to become clergy, and as a result they became educated. And so many of the Reformed religion's clergy were some of the most educated people, and therefore they influenced the education of others. An article entitled Presbyterian Clergy in South Carolina talks about how the Reformed religion influenced the South in education and politics. And it talks about how since many of the Reformed religion's clergy were educators, the concepts that they believed in, such as the right of mankind to liberty, their political ideas were passed on to their students. Also in the Mark Hall article, it talks about how 95% of Congregationalist ministers were college graduates. Consequently, they tended to be the most educated and some of the most influential members of their communities. He talks about how the Reformed religion exercised their influence through a variety of venues. New England was the intellectual and cultural center of America, according to Mark Hall. So because the Reformed religion made up 82% of New England's population, and New England was the intellectual and cultural center of America, it's safe to say that the Reformed religion played a major part throughout all the colonies in its influence. Now, to look at its active participation in the Revolution, Leonard Kramer's article talks about how they were involved in resistance to Britain. It mentions David Rice, a Reformed religious clergy who organized frontier gatherings to support resistance. The article, Presbyterian Clergy in South Carolina, talks about other men who were influential, other Presbyterian clergymen such as William Tennant, Joseph Alexander, Thomas Rees, and it talks about how they would go around and deliver stirring sermons to encourage the people to resist Britain. An important idea to understand is that these men felt that the infringement of personal liberty was one step away from the infringement of religious liberty. That's why they were so opposed to England and what they were doing to the colonists. And probably nothing speaks so strongly as to how active they were in support of resistance as to the fact that British representatives were trying to discourage the Reformed religion. One governor actually encouraged Dartmouth, a British representative, to discourage the colonists from adopting Presbyterianism and encourage them towards Anglicanism. In Hippocrates' Twins, Religion and Politics, it talks about how a British secretary wrote to Sir William Howe, and this is what he said: "Presbyterianism is really at the bottom of the whole conspiracy. It has supplied it with vigor and will never rest," talking about the Presbyterians' action in supporting the revolution. Now, moving on to the doctrinal beliefs. As discussed in the Religion and Founding of the American Republic, the colonists arrived in America already with doctrinal beliefs that they would use later on to support the revolution. In the book Glorious Cause and on the website Encyclopedia of Virginia, it talks about how the Great Awakening influenced the American Revolution, because out of the Great Awakening you get the ecclesiastical structure and the doctrinal beliefs of the Reformed religion, and how it echoes the same sentiments of the American Revolution. And as historians, we must be dedicated to an investigated reconstruction of primary sources. And if you look at the primary sources during this time, you can see how many of the writings and even speeches by Patrick Henry echoed the same ideas of the patriotic sentiment. The Reformed religion's belief and the patriotic belief seem to go hand in hand. In the sermon, The Dominion of Providence over the Passions of Men, delivered during this time, John Witherspoon talks about how the preservation of their civil liberties in this time would be the preservation of the religious liberty in future generations. They felt that they were fighting for that religious liberty. In addition, John Adams' article, Dissertation of Canon and Feudal Law, talks about how colonists believed they had natural rights given to them by God. And among these rights was the right to knowledge, and the right to knowledge of the conduct and character of their rulers. He talks about how tyrannies have sprung up in civilizations past, and he believed the only resistance against these tyrannies was knowledge. And he believed, in his writings, he stated that often that knowledge came from religious organizations. He specifically mentions the Reformation and how people rose up against the tyrannies because they gained knowledge. He also says that he believed Republican forms of government came out of religious organizations. In Stephen Case's Defense of Arms Vindicated, he gives a defense of why it was okay religiously for the colonists to take up arms against Britain. People struggled with revolting against an authority, but he said if that authority had abused their power, they were no longer ordained by God. And he also believed that even though Britain had not specifically taken away the freedom of religion from the colonists, with acts such as the Declaratory Act, they were one step away from taking away that freedom of religion, and it was dangerous. In a letter written in 1775, many of the Presbyterian ministers gathered together and sent out a letter to their congregations and other Presbyterian ministers, and they explained in this letter why it was okay and why they believed they should revolt against Britain. And they said that they deserved rights and representations as Englishmen, and for England to take away their money without their consent is contrary to the laws of God and contrary to the gospel of Christ. The letter also stated that the king's power is not unlimited, but bound by the laws of God. In the American Revolution, a religious revival, the author talks about how Calvinism, a reformed religion, provided revolutionary America with the more democratic and evangelical religion. After the Great Awakening, religion split into kind of two roads, the road of rationalism and the road of Calvinism. Rationalism had taught people for centuries that really the only way you could achieve salvation or achieve grace was through this perception and knowledge of God. It had to be highly attained. It was hard to get. But But Calvinism promoted this idea that anybody could attain salvation, attain grace, and it came from a personal relationship with God. The Calvinistic doctrines of election, predestination, and irresistible grace seemed more democratic and egalitarian than the rationalism view of salvation. They believed you didn't have to be highly trained or highly educated to achieve salvation, but anybody could receive it. And those ideas of freedom and liberty that was available to individuals was appealing to the patriots. In the article, once again, by Mark Hall, he talks about how the Reformed religion believed that church and civil state were ordained by God, but that they were to work together to create a Christian society. He also talked about how the Reformers believed that God is sovereign and only God, not the king. And also, they believed in the commitment to the depravity, the total depravity of man, and that doctrine. And because of those beliefs, they believed that ecclesiastical and civil authority should be limited. The Reformers also believed in the idea of covenants, this agreement between man and government, which was reflected in the social contract theory. And they believed that the Bible taught that government should be limited, should be based on the consent of the governed, and unjust rulers should be overthrown. Which leads me to lastly, the third way that we can see how the Reformed religion played a major part is through their ecclesiastical structure. In the article Hippocrates' Twins, Religion and Politics, it describes Reformed churches as broadly based, elective, and often Republican. You see, when the Americans arrived, they had a lack of clergymen. So the gathered congregations together would elect laymen to become leaders in the church. And it was based on this idea of the consent of the governed. And this consent-based church government gave them an understanding of how larger society should work through election, through representation, a Republican form of government. And many of these churches displayed characteristics of voluntary associations. Another article by Joseph Small discusses the impact that the Presbyterian Church had in revolutionary America. He stated that the Presbyterian Church's voice mattered, and it transformed American culture, because the way that their church government was structured represented the democracy that the patriots desired and would later adopt and push for in the American Revolution. So I believe that through a study of these three things, the Reformed religion's active participation, their ecclesiastical structure, and doctrinal beliefs, we can clearly see the role that they played. Now, of course, the Enlightenment and other men and events such as Locke or Montesquieu played an important part, but the Reformed religion definitely has a part in American revolutionary history. Thank you.